The France 24 debate, we're discussing allegations of huge wads of cash circulating between the African continent and the high halls of power here in France with former French ambassador Michel Rimbaud. Also with us, Xavier Guilbert, attorney who for 8 years lived in Ivory Coast. Thierry Lévesque of the Reuters news agency, recent author of Intouchable, Untouchable, all about Jacques Chirac's corruption trial. And the deputy bureau chief for the French news agency AFP, Dave Clark from New York City. He is the correspondent for Sud Quotidien, the daily newspaper out of Dakar. Dam Babou, welcome back to all you gentlemen. I want to show you the cartoon, by the way, that Belgian daily Le Soir published this Tuesday regarding the affair, where you see Jacques Chirac's wife, Jacques Chirac, who's not attending his own trial because of memory loss, and his wife saying, "Come on, you remember a Congolese guy with a leopard skin hat, and where are those briefcases? Where did you put them?" And Jacques Chirac, with who can't seem to quite recall what's going on. By the way, it's not just Jacques Chirac, as we mentioned in part one. It's Robert Bourgi, the confidant of both Nicolas Sarkozy and before him Chirac, really has it in, it seems, for Dominique de Villepin, who was at one point the chief of staff to Chirac, then became foreign minister and prime minister. He says Villepin took diamond-studded Swiss watches from Omar Bongo, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. The lawyer claims Africans knew of the poet-politician's tastes.
For example, Monsieur de Villepin would welcome President Bongo and other African heads of states who knew that he liked African art and that he was an admirer of Napoleon. So he'd be offered busts of the emperor, rare pieces, and he received African masks.
Ces allégations sont mensongères.
These allegations are untruthful and disgraceful. This is an example of the targeting and will to soil Jacques Chirac's presidency at a time when he's on trial, and a few days before the Court of Appeal makes a decision over the Clearstream case.
Thierry Lévesque, does Dominique de Villepin have a point? Is this all orchestrated at this? Why is it coming out now? Why does Robert Bourgi suddenly have a conscience?
I think what can only be troubled by the coincidence of these allegations and the proximity of the appeal court's decision on the Clearstream scandal, where Mr. Villepin has big chances to be cleared and to be on a target for being a presidential candidate, dangerous for Mr. Sarkozy, a potential competitor. So it doesn't say that these allegations are false, but one can only be troubled by this coincidence.
So this serves the interest of the incumbent president?
Sorry?
This serves the interests of the incumbent president?
I think it serves objectively the interest of Mr. Sarkozy, which is blanked in this interview of Mr. Bourgi. Mr. Bourgi says Mr. Sarkozy did not go on with these practices. And it puts another charge on Mr. Villepin's back, as perhaps the first Clearstream charge is going to disappear within days. So I think, I don't think it's a real coincidence.
Do you agree, Xavier Guilbert?
No, not quite. I don't think that's really. At first glance, I thought also it was the case, but I don't think so, because Nicolas Sarkozy had no interest in launching this case on Africa, on the relationship with Africa. He has no interest. So I don't think Nicolas Sarkozy is behind at second glance. But if you look after Mr. de Villepin behavior during the 10 years as foreign minister, there are some strange things. You can observe his relationship with some head of state in Africa, like Laurent Gbagbo. Very, very strange. If you observe that, you can make your own idea on that.
Michel Rimbaud, did you observe any strange behavior on the part of Dominique de Villepin when he was foreign minister?
Special strange behavior on the prime minister when he was the prime minister. But I think that there is a clear linkage, an obvious linkage between this affair, this story, and the presidential election. I think that, of course, it is well known, even, putting aside the Clearstream trial or any other case, that it's very interesting for the the now president, Mr. Sarkozy, to keep strong pressure on Dominique de Villepin that is likely to run for the presidency if nothing happen. He could anyway run for the presidency in next year, and even of course it is very unlikely to be elected as the president, but he could pick up at the first round of the election some maybe 2 or 3% of the votes, and so it's enough to maybe to change the order of the candidates after the first round. For example, it could be very interesting to pass on to the second round or not to pass, to be prevented from, and I think this is the goal.
Well, hold on. I want to hear from Dave Clark. Do you think that Robert Bourgi may be doing Nicolas Sarkozy's dirty work?
I think we're all a bit confused about that. Our first instinct when we saw the newspaper was, Sarkozy's let loose his attack dog on Villepin, the man he hates, to try and dirty him before the election campaign starts. And then we think about it a bit harder and think, well, this hurts Sarkozy as much as it helps him, and we start to wonder. The one way that you can bridge that gap is to say that Sarkozy's hatred for Villepin goes beyond political logic. He said before he wants to hang him from a butcher's hook. And according to Bourgi, Villepin has said of Sarkozy, we're going to use this money to stuff the dwarf. Now, these two men hate each other. I don't think that's too strong a word. And it's possible that he let Bourgi do this, hoping that it would destroy Villepin. He doesn't need to destroy Villepin. Villepin might get 2-3%. If Sarkozy can't beat him, then he's not going to be president. I think what this does is it damages one of the strengths of Sarkozy's last few months. As he tries to rebuild his presidency, he's claiming a new moral role for France and Africa. He says that French forces under UN mandate managed to ensure that the correct election results was recognised in Côte d'Ivoire. They knocked out Laurent Gbagbo. Now French aviation and French money and French diplomatic support has seen the victory of the rebels in Libya. He was trying to turn the page on this French history in Africa and saying, look, here we're on the side of the Democrats, not the rich dictators. But now everyone's talking about Bongo and Houphouët-Boigny and Abdoulaye Wade and Sassou Nguesso. No one is talking about the NTC and about Ouattara. This is a shot in the wing of one of the few things that Nicolas Sarkozy can claim to have done well.
But I think you forget one thing by making this reflection, that is, you think that Mr. Sarkozy's attitude towards Mr. de Villepin is rational, but it's not. If you had attended the trial, Mr. Sarkozy is completely furious over Mr. Villepin. He's completely convinced of his responsibility in this Clearstream false listings affair. And he would make everything, I think. So if Mr. Villepin is blanked by the appeals court in 2 days, it would be a big defeat for Mr. Sarkozy, who had put the highest pressures on the French judicial system.
Let's talk about the image all of this gives of not French politics, and dare we say it, even France. Le Monde's cartoonist Plantu shows, in a nod to the Rwandan president's state visit to Paris these days, the under-the-table dealings that are dominating the headlines in this country. On the one side, you see under the table, it's wads of cash, and on the other, it's the weight of the past with all those killed in the genocide in Rwanda. And the wads of cash is not good for anyone in French politics, perhaps, except even the far right. Who, they're all rotten to the core kind of talk must be surfacing as a result of all of this, even though I know that Bourgi is also accusing the leader of the far right of taking cash, Robert, of Xavier Guilbert.
Yes, yes, of course. Bourgi is accusing extreme right. It's the French extreme right is very much involved in politics Africa. You have seen the Gbagbo case recently.
Everyone goes to Africa, even the far right.
Even the far right. And I remember I was in Africa when Le Pen was received by Houphouët-Boigny at the for lunch, and it's 20 years, more than 20 years ago. So it's a long history. But French politics with Africa.
But as Dave Clark said, the French president, who when he was on the campaign trail said, listen, this was back in 2006, in a speech he gave in Benin's capital, this way of dealing with the past is over.
We have to close the chapter on understandings shadow cells, secrets, and ambiguities. It is as a friend that I say this to my African friends.
So, in other words, the end of what they call the France-Afrique promised to Nicolas Sarkozy. However, on the France 24 debate Facebook page, Adobong writes, when the mad dog of North Africa, he's referring, I guess, to Gaddafi there, mentioned at the beginning of the Libyan conflict that he paid for Sarkozy's election, no one took it seriously. So why now? The emotions demonstrated at Omar Bongo's funeral by both Sarkozy, Chirac, and the rest of the French entourage showed how juicy African cash tastes. Leave the old gang alone, he writes on our Facebook page. We could perhaps look at those images of Jacques Chirac standing alongside Nicolas Sarkozy at the 2009 funeral of Gabon's longtime president. And it was a very startling image indeed. Michel Rimbaud, when you look at those images of Chirac and Sarkozy together, what does it tell you?
Well, what I noticed at first, we are talking about the funeral of Bongo, the Congolese presidents. I can see and remember the difference that existed between these crowding of heads of, French politicians and the presidents, prime ministers, and ministers. Well, the whole political class that was, attending the funerals of Mr. Bongo, and the difference that existed with the funeral of Leopold Sédar Senghor, where no politician did travel to the funeral to attend to Senegal's, yes, for this occasion. I think there is some meaning, I think, in this case.
Let me ask Dan Babou about this. Dan Babou, as the ambassador rightly pointed out, no prominent French politician went to the funeral of Senegal's founding father. And why did every single president and prime minister of the living president, prime minister of the French Fifth Republic attend the funeral of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, Ivory Coast's founding father?
But you know, that funeral, that was a continuation of the same theme at the head of the Ivory Coast. In Senegal, at that time, Abdou Diouf had just left the power, and Jacques Chirac, who was the very good friend of Abdou Diouf, had a very bad relationship with Abdoulaye Wade at that time, so they didn't man the fence yet. But after much difficulties, when Senegal has a money problem, was about to sell his part in the Sonatel, the telecommunications company, they had to go to France and look for 80 billion CFA to pay even the salaries at that time. Abdoulaye Wade then changed, and especially when Abdoulaye Wade started to think of putting his son as his successor, he needed le Palais Élysée. He needed really the help from Sarkozy.
All right, so Wade hadn't been in power a long time, but is it also the fact that Senghor was maybe not that kind of politician?
Exactly. Senghor was not the kind of guy with a briefcase full of cash at all. People who knew Senghor even can tell you he knew barely the face of the bills of CFA or franc French. For that matter, he didn't really deal with cash in his hand or in his palace. That's very, very different.
And so they attend. All of them attend the funeral of Félix Houphouët-Boigny. They all attend the funeral of Omar Bongo. Thierry Lévesque, you've covered these trials day in, day out, all these corruption trials. To get back to what Le Monde was wondering about on its front page, do you sometimes feel like it's a banana republic here?
But I think, as my colleague said, the corruption, of course, exists in France, has existed for a long time. It's still existing as we are speaking now, but it's a taboo in the French political life and in the French medias. Perhaps we don't speak enough of these big trials that it doesn't make a fuss as it should. But I think it exists in the international commercial life. My colleague mentioned this scandal avoided by Mr. Blair on a big arms deal. France is not the only country to sell arms to deal with oil-producing countries, and in all these businesses, corruption is present.
France isn't the only one, but Dave Clark, it's got a bit of an image problem here.
It does have a bit of an image problem. One example I would give of how it's handled differently in what the French call the Anglo-Saxon world, the English-speaking world. When I was in Nigeria, I lived in Nigeria for 4 years, and Nigeria has a reputation as a very corrupt country. A lot of the senior Nigerian politicians employ lobbying firms in Washington, D.C. Now, they send millions of dollars over to these firms in Washington, D.C. They all maintain houses in Maryland and around about Washington, D.C. They spend quite a lot of time over there talking to American politicians. And their lobbying firms can legally then fund the campaigns of U.S. congressmen and senators. Now, a lot of money goes to fund American political campaigns from African dictatorships, just as over many years. But what's different about France is there doesn't seem to be the same impulse to hide it. We talk about it being a taboo, but at the same time, there's an impunity. No one is ever going to get convicted of this here. There have been some Americans convicted of taking money from Nigerians, and there have been some Nigerians convicted of giving money. Not enough, perhaps, but in France, these trials go on for years and years, and President Chirac is going to say now, I can't remember, as he's done in his other trials.
Michel Rimbaud, because we're almost out of time, that's an important point. Is the part of the problem in this country the legal system? By the time Robert Bourgi case today, there is a case that's been opened as a result of this. Do you think that by the time it goes to an eventual trial, it'll just be a history lesson, no longer a court case?
Well, I don't know. There is a big. We invoked some minutes ago in the first part of the program. We talked about the people in the political class, the political world that used to like money for personal use, and the use of money for political purposes, for financing political parties, for example. I think those are two different things. Even if in both cases money is at the center of the preoccupation, the personal care of the political leaders. But I think those are two different things. As far as the second part is concerned, financing the political parties. I think there is something strange because, of course, political corruption doesn't exist only in France. It exists in many countries. But in a word,
because we're almost out of time, is it campaigning? Is it campaign reform, or is it reforming the justice system?
It was not prohibited several years ago. There was a turning point when it was legally prohibited to finance whatsoever kind of money coming from big companies or corporations and to finance political parties. But in the past, I think that it was not illegal, and so it was common use. When it is prohibited, of course, you can turn to the past and say that, it's very ugly to do that and to behave like that. But it was not prohibited. And I think there is a mixing up. Of course, corruption couldn't stop in one moment, in 1 minute.
All right, we'll find out, of course, if this is a campaign issue. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank Xavier Guilbert. I want to thank Dave Clark, Michel Rimbaud, and Thierry Lévesque for joining us here in the studio. We want to thank Dan Babou for being with us from New York City, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's time for Business, and that's hosted by Tom Burgess-Watson.